On November 15, 1942, a marvel of engineering, the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary slid into the water from Henry Kaiser's Richmond shipyard. From the moment its keel was laid to its triumphant launch, a mere 4 days and 15.5 hours had passed. This astonishing feat meant a single cargo vessel was built faster than a German U-boat could traverse the Atlantic, a devastating blow to the Axis powers' naval strategy. But this was just one example of a nation's immense capacity, a sleeping giant awakened, proving Adolf Hitler's catastrophic underestimation of America. How did a country deemed decayed by the Führer unleash such unparalleled industrial power, and what did that mean for the fate of his thousand-year Reich? We will delve into the profound shift in American production later in this narrative. Earlier that year, on January 7, 1942, from his East Prussian headquarters, Adolf Hitler delivered a grim prognosis for the United States, a judgment that would ultimately seal Germany's destiny. He confided in his inner circle, dismissing America's future as negligible, labeling it a nation in decline. Hitler cited what he perceived as its inherent weaknesses, a pervasive, racial problem, deep-seated social inequalities, and a societal fabric he believed was half Judaized and the other half negrified. He questioned how such a disparate state could possibly endure. Meanwhile, 7,000 miles away, in a modest shipyard office in Richmond, California, Henry Kaiser, a 57-year-old industrialist, was sketching on a hotel notepad. Though his expertise lay in constructing dams, roads, and bridges, he had never ventured into shipbuilding, a notoriously intricate field. Conventional shipbuilders claimed it took 8 months to complete a cargo vessel. Yet, Kaiser, looking at his drawing, boldly declared to his team that they would achieve it in just 4 days. Hitler believed the Americans were inherently soft. Kaiser was about to prove him monumentally mistaken. The seeds of this profound miscalculation were sown long before the first shots of the war were fired. In the years preceding the conflict, German military intelligence meticulously compiled reports on America's industrial might, military preparedness, and national character. Their conclusions were consistently unflattering. America was a land of merchants and consumers, not warriors. Its army, in 1939, was among the smallest globally, even smaller than Portugal's. Its factories produced cars and refrigerators, not tanks and planes. Its populace, accustomed to prolonged peace, lacked the stomach for sacrifice. When President Franklin Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that the United States would produce 50,000 aircraft annually, Hitler's advisors dismissed it as pure propaganda. German high command regarded the claim as preposterous, considering American military aircraft production in 1939 had totaled fewer than 3,000 planes. A nearly 20-fold increase seemed utterly absurd. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest confidants, mirrored his leader's disdain. Göring had forged the German Air Force from nothing into Europe's most feared aerial power. He understood the intricate demands of modern combat aircraft production, the precision engineering, specialized alloys, trained personnel, and years of experience needed to perfect manufacturing techniques. America, he believed, possessed none of these advantages. The idea that they could simply conjure an air force from automobile factories struck him as laughable. German generals had encountered American troops before, during the final year of the First World War. American forces had arrived in France and performed adequately, but they entered the conflict late, suffered relatively light casualties compared to their European counterparts, and contributed minimally to the war's strategic direction. The memory of those green doughboys solidified the belief that Americans lacked the necessary resilience for sustained combat. Albert Speer, who would later serve as Hitler's Minister of Armaments, often attended the Führer's dinner conversations about America. Hitler frequently asserted that Americans had played an insignificant role in the Great War, making few sacrifices in blood. He was convinced they would crumble under the trials of fire, given their low fighting qualities. In Hitler's view, no unified American people truly existed, they were merely a mass of immigrants from many nations and many races. This racial analysis was fundamental to Hitler's worldview. He believed national strength stemmed from racial purity and homogeneity. Germany, with its supposed Aryan bloodline, possessed an inherent superiority that would manifest on the battlefield. America, a mongrel nation of immigrants, Jews, and African Americans, could not possibly match the martial spirit of the German Volk. However, the German analysis suffered from a critical flaw. They measured American potential by its peacetime performance. They observed a nation that had not mobilized and concluded it could not. They saw factories producing consumer goods and assumed these plants could not manufacture weapons. They perceived a diverse population and believed diversity equated to weakness. they were wrong on every count. The transformation began even before America officially entered the war. In the summer of 1940, with France fallen and Britain under siege, Roosevelt challenged American industry to achieve what he termed a miracle of production. Automobile factories would cease car manufacturing. Appliance plants would stop making refrigerators. Every lathe, every press, every assembly line in America would be repurposed for war production. This was not merely a call to action, it was a fundamental restructuring of the American economy. In 1941, over 3 million automobiles rolled off American assembly lines. Over the next 4 years, only 139 more would be built. The entire capacity of the automotive industry was redirected to weapons production. Chrysler manufactured fuselages. General Motors produced airplane engines, guns, trucks, and tanks. Packard built Rolls-Royce engines for the British Air Force. Companies that had never produced anything more dangerous than kitchen appliances rapidly learned to manufacture ammunition. The conversion happened with remarkable speed, largely because American industry possessed capabilities the Germans never truly understood. The secret lay in standardization and interchangeable parts. American factories had pioneered mass production techniques, enabling different facilities to manufacture components that fit together perfectly. A carburetor made in Ohio would fit an engine from Michigan, powering a vehicle assembled in California. This system, developed over decades for civilian production, was now applied to the weapons of war. Skeptics argued it was impossible. Aircraft were not automobiles, you couldn't stamp out a bomber like a Ford. The tolerances were too precise, the systems too complex. A single heavy bomber contained over 1 million parts, an automobile, only 15,000. Henry Kaiser disregarded the naysayers. In December 1940, he secured a government contract to build 30 cargo ships for the British. He had no shipyard, no shipbuilding experience, and no workers trained in maritime construction. What he possessed was a system. Kaiser approached shipbuilding not as a traditional craft, but as a manufacturing challenge. The specific product, whether a ship, a dam, or a highway, was less important than the underlying process. Every manufacturing process, he believed, could be analyzed, broken into components, optimized, and scaled. Traditional shipbuilding relied on knowledge passed down through apprenticeships, with skilled riveters spending years mastering their trade. Kaiser didn't have years, he had months. So, he designed processes that could be learned in days. He substituted capital for labor wherever possible, investing in machinery to perform tasks previously done by hand. The established shipbuilders maintained that this approach would never work. Ships were too complex, the ocean too unforgiving. Vessels built by amateurs, they warned, would surely sink. Kaiser proved them wrong. His ships were not only built faster than traditional vessels but also better. The defect rate at Kaiser's yards was less than half that of conventional shipyards. The same systematic approach that accelerated production also improved quality. Kaiser applied the principles that had built the Hoover Dam ahead of schedule. He modularized the shipbuilding process. Instead of constructing a ship from the keel up on a single slipway, he prefabricated entire sections of the vessel in different locations and assembled them like building blocks. He utilized welding instead of riveting, a faster method requiring less skilled labor. He recruited workers from across the country, providing housing, establishing childcare centers, and creating a healthcare system to ensure their health and productivity. The transformation of ordinary Americans into shipbuilders occurred at a pace that defied conventional wisdom. Men and women who had never seen the ocean, held a welding torch, or set foot in an industrial facility learned to build ships in weeks. Kaiser's training programs were ruthlessly efficient. A new worker could become a competent welder in just 10 days, in 30 days, they could be a productive member of a shipbuilding team. Workers came from all walks of life, farmers from Oklahoma who had lost their land to drought, factory workers from Detroit laid off during the Depression, women who had never worked outside the home, and African Americans seeking opportunities denied to them in the segregated South. The workforce at Kaiser's Richmond yards eventually peaked at over 90,000 people, with nearly a third of them women. These women, working in factories, became symbols of American wartime mobilization. They drilled rivets, welded seams, and installed wiring, performing work that had been exclusively male before the war. The government promoted their contributions through posters and films featuring strong, determined women in factory settings, images that became iconic representations of the home front effort. Thousands of such women across America worked in shipyards and aircraft plants, demonstrating that the workforce could expand in ways German planners never anticipated. The established shipbuilders watched in disbelief. They had built ships the same way for decades, certain of what was possible. Kaiser's methods violated every principle of their craft. Ships were supposed to be riveted, not welded. Construction was meant to happen on the slipway, not in scattered fabrication shops. Workers were to be trained over years, not weeks. But Kaiser's methods worked. In 1941, the average time to build a Liberty ship, the standard cargo vessel of the war, was 230 days. By 1942, Kaiser's yards had reduced that to 45 days, then 30, then 20. In November 1942, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard built the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary in 4 days and 15.5 hours. From laying the keel to launching the completed vessel took less time than a German U-boat needed to cross the Atlantic. The Germans now faced a strategic crisis they had not foreseen. Admiral Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, had based his strategy on a simple calculation: his submarines would sink Allied shipping faster than the Allies could replace it. In the early months of 1942, this strategy appeared to be succeeding. German U-boats prowled the American East Coast during what they termed the second happy time, sinking hundreds of merchant ships within sight of shore. Oil tankers burned off the coast of Florida, and cargo vessels went down within view of New Jersey beaches. Reinhard Hartigan, commander of U-123, was among the first U-boat captains to hunt American waters. In January 1942, he torpedoed ships so close to shore that he could see the glow of city lights reflected off the smoke. The Americans had not implemented blackout procedures, nor had they organized convoys. They seemed almost oblivious to attack. Hartigan sank 8 ships on his first patrol and returned to Germany a hero. Other U-boat commanders followed. Through the first 6 months of 1942, German submarines sank nearly 400 ships in American coastal waters. The losses were catastrophic: oil that should have fueled Allied tanks pooled on Atlantic beaches, food destined for British civilians rotted at the bottom of the sea, and strategic materials essential to the war effort vanished beneath the waves. Dönitz believed he was winning. His submarines were inflicting damage at a rate that exceeded his most optimistic projections. If these losses continued, Britain would be strangled, and the American war effort would collapse before it could fully mobilize. But even as the U-boats accumulated kills, the shipyards accelerated. In 1942, American shipyards launched 8 million tons of new shipping. In 1943, they launched 19 million tons. By the fall of 1943, new construction exceeded losses for the first time. Every ship the U-boats sank was replaced by 2 more. Dönitz watched the numbers with growing alarm. His submarines were sinking ships at a rate that would have won the First World War. But this was not the First World War. This was a conflict against an enemy whose industrial capacity defied comprehension. The math was merciless. Dönitz calculated that his U-boats needed to sink 700,000 tons of shipping per month to strangle Britain. In 1942, they came close, but by 1943, American shipyards alone were launching more than 1 million tons per month. The target kept moving, always receding, always beyond reach. Worse, the Americans were learning. The early disasters off the East Coast had exposed severe failures in anti-submarine warfare. Convoys were organized. Aircraft were deployed to patrol shipping lanes. New technologies like radar and improved sonar gave defenders advantages they had lacked. In May 1943, Dönitz was forced to withdraw his U-boats from the Atlantic. In a single month, 43 submarines were lost. The tonnage they sank no longer justified the casualties they suffered. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Germany needed to win to strangle Britain, was lost. The U-boat crews who survived the May disaster returned to occupied France in shock. They had gone to sea believing they were winning, they came back to port understanding they had lost. The endless convoys they had hunted now sailed with escorts they could not penetrate. Allied aircraft, once rare, now seemed to be everywhere. The technological superiority German submarines had enjoyed was gone. What happened at sea was replicated in the air. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant outside Detroit became the ultimate symbol of American industrial might. Designed by famed industrial architect Albert Kahn, the facility covered 3.5 million square feet, making it the largest factory under one roof anywhere in the world. Its purpose, to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine heavy bomber, far more complex than anything Ford had ever manufactured. The challenges were immense. The B-24 had over 1 million parts and more than 300,000 rivets in 550 different sizes. It required precision engineering that the automobile industry had never attempted. Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, studied the methods of consolidated aircraft, the B-24's designer, and found them primitive. Bombers were being assembled outdoors, by hand, using techniques that hadn't changed in decades. Sorensen proposed something revolutionary: he would build bombers on a moving assembly line, just like automobiles. Critics called the idea insane. Dutch Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation, scoffed that you couldn't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight. The skepticism wasn't unreasonable. Aircraft manufacturing was fundamentally different from automobile production. A car could have minor variations and still function perfectly. An aircraft with minor variations might fall out of the sky. Tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. Materials were exotic alloys that behaved differently than automotive steel. The systems, hydraulics, electrical, pneumatic, had to work in perfect harmony at 25,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures. Willow Run struggled initially. The government kept changing the aircraft's design, disrupting the assembly line. Workers had to learn entirely new skills. The press mocked the facility as, "Will it run?" instead of, "Willow Run." Senator Harry Truman investigated the delays and publicly questioned whether Ford could deliver on its promises. The problems were real. Consolidated Aircraft, which had designed the B-24, kept making modifications based on combat experience. Every change required Ford to retool its assembly line. Dies that had cost thousands of dollars became obsolete overnight. Workers who had mastered one process had to be retrained for another. Ford's response was characteristically stubborn. The company assigned 200 engineers to work around the clock, converting Consolidated's hand-drawn sketches into precise manufacturing specifications. They produced 5 miles of technical drawings per day. When Consolidated's modifications rendered drawings obsolete before they could be implemented, Ford engineers started over without complaint. The company also decentralized production. Instead of building entire aircraft at Willow Run, Ford created a network of subcontractors who manufactured components that were then shipped to the main plant for final assembly. Engines came from Buick in Flint. Propellers came from Hamilton Standard in Connecticut. Landing gear came from Goodyear in Ohio. The logistics alone would have been impossible for any organization that hadn't spent decades mastering supply chain management. By 1944, the problems were solved. Willow Run produced a B-24 every 63 minutes. At peak production in April 1944, the plant turned out 453 bombers in a single month. Between April 24 and April 26 of that year, 100 completed bombers flew away from Willow Run in just 72 hours. The workers operated in 2 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The remaining 6 hours each day were used to restock parts, perform maintenance, and change tooling. Even with this relentlessly long schedule, the workforce was reduced from 42,000 to 17,000 as efficiency improved. The same number of bombers required fewer and fewer workers to produce. The Army Air Forces eventually had to tell Ford to slow down. They had no place to park all the aircraft. Storage areas at training bases overflowed with B-24s waiting for crews. The production capacity exceeded the military's ability to deploy the aircraft. Meanwhile, American aircraft production overall reached numbers that the German High Command had declared impossible. In 1944 alone, the United States built more than 96,000 military aircraft. That single year's production exceeded Japan's total aircraft output for the entire war. Between 1940 and 1945, American industry accounted for roughly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. The scale defied comprehension. At its peak, American industry was building more aircraft in a single month than Germany had possessed at the start of the war. The assembly lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Shifts changed at midnight and noon, the factories never stopped. Consider what these numbers meant in practical terms. 300,000 aircraft, stretched wingtip to wingtip, would extend for more than 30,000 miles, enough to circle the Earth at the equator. The fuel to fly these aircraft required an entire petroleum infrastructure, tankers, pipelines, and refineries dedicated to aviation gasoline. The crews to man them required a training establishment that processed hundreds of thousands of young men through programs that turned civilians into combat aviators in less than a year. The scale of American mobilization went beyond what simple statistics could capture. Behind every aircraft, every ship, every tank, was a supply chain that stretched back to mines, forests, and farms across the continent. Aluminum came from bauxite or shipped from South America. Rubber came from plantations in Liberia and Brazil after Japanese conquests cut off Asian supplies. Cotton for uniforms came from southern farms, food from the agricultural heartland. The entire economy was reoriented toward war production. Women who had never worked outside the home learned to operate machinery their mothers had never seen. African Americans migrated north to take factory jobs previously closed to them. Rural Americans moved to industrial cities where housing shortages forced families to live in shifts, with day workers sleeping in beds vacated by night workers. The social transformation was as dramatic as the industrial one. The Germans faced the consequences of their misjudgment in the skies over Europe. Their pilots were among the best trained in the world. Their aircraft, particularly fighters like the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, were formidable machines. In individual engagements, German pilots often outperformed their American counterparts. The early American bomber crews were painfully green. Many pilots had fewer than 300 hours of total flight time when they began flying combat missions. Navigation errors sent formations miles off course. Bombing accuracy was poor. Coordination with fighter escorts was imperfect. German pilots exploited these weaknesses ruthlessly. The Luftwaffe developed tactics specifically designed to break up bomber formations and pick off stragglers. Head-on attacks at closing speeds of over 600 miles per hour gave gunners only seconds to react. German fighters, equipped with rockets, could fire from beyond the range of defensive machine guns. But attrition was relentless. For every German aircraft shot down, the Americans could produce 3 more. For every experienced German pilot killed, the Americans could train 5 replacements. The Luftwaffe bled out slowly, not from a single decisive defeat, but from the cumulative weight of an enemy who could absorb losses and keep coming. The American training programs were industrial in their own right. Flight schools processed thousands of cadets simultaneously. Instructors flew multiple training sorties per day. Aircraft were available in abundance because the same factories that built combat planes also built trainers. The entire system was designed for throughput, for turning raw material into finished product as efficiently as possible. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was sustaining losses of 25% of its aircrew and 40% of its aircraft every month. These were losses no air force could survive indefinitely. The Thousand-Year Reich did not have 1,000 years of pilots to sacrifice. German pilots who had begun the war with years of training and hundreds of flight hours were replaced by men who had weeks of instruction and dozens of hours in the cockpit. The experience level of Luftwaffe fighter pilots dropped steadily throughout 1944. By the war's end, some German pilots were flying their first combat mission with less than 100 hours of total flight time. The Americans, meanwhile, continued to improve. Early bomber crews had been painfully inexperienced, but the survivors of the 1943 raids became the instructors who trained the 1944 crews. Tactics evolved. Equipment improved. The P-51 Mustang, with its long range and exceptional performance, finally gave bomber formations the protection they needed. The German misjudgment extended beyond industry to the fighting quality of American soldiers themselves. In February 1943, American ground forces met the German army for the first time at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The result appeared to confirm every German prejudice. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps tore through the inexperienced American positions. Units broke and ran. Equipment was abandoned. Command and control collapsed. American casualties exceeded 6,000. Some German officers who had dismissed Americans as soft now had battlefield evidence to support their contempt. The Americans at Kasserine were green in ways that only combat could reveal. Many soldiers had never fired their weapons in anger. Officers who had trained for years in peacetime conditions found themselves unable to function under fire. Radio communications failed. Coordination between infantry and armor broke down. Units that should have supported each other fought in isolation. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, General George Patton's son-in-law, was among those captured during the debacle. He had led an armored counterattack against German positions at Sidi Bouzid. The attack ran straight into German panzers and anti-tank guns positioned in a classic ambush. American tanks burst into flames, infantry scattered. Waters was wounded, captured, and spent the rest of the war in a German prison camp. Stories like his multiplied across the battlefield. American artillery was poorly positioned. American infantry dug foxholes in the wrong places. American armor advanced without reconnaissance. The Germans, who had been fighting in the desert for 2 years, exploited every mistake with professional precision. Rommel himself initially scorned the green American troops. They seemed undisciplined and poorly led compared to the British forces he had been fighting for 2 years. The debacle at Kasserine reinforced the German belief that American material superiority could be offset by German fighting quality. Reports from the battle filtered back to Berlin. German intelligence officers compiled assessments that confirmed what Hitler had always believed: the Americans were soft, their equipment was abundant, but their soldiers were weak. German martial spirit would triumph over American industrial power. But Rommel was too good a general to let initial impressions harden into permanent assumptions. He watched what happened after Kasserine, and what he saw troubled him. The Americans recovered with startling speed. Within weeks of the disaster, they reorganized their forces, relieved incompetent commanders, and implemented brutal lessons learned. General George Patton took command of the demoralized Second Corps and transformed it through sheer force of will. Tactics improved. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery tightened. Air support became more effective. Patton was a force of nature. He descended on the Second Corps like a thunderstorm, demanding discipline, punishing sloppiness, and driving his men to standards they had never met before. Soldiers who had slouched through the Kasserine disaster found themselves polishing brass, standing at attention, and training harder than they had ever trained in their lives. But Patton did more than impose discipline. He studied why the Americans had failed and implemented specific corrections. Artillery forward observers were repositioned. Tank tactics were revised. Infantry learned to coordinate more closely with armor. The lessons of Kasserine were analyzed, documented, and disseminated. The American military possessed an institutional commitment to learning from failure that the Germans failed to recognize. After Kasserine, the Army's Ground Forces commander, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, conducted a comprehensive review of what had gone wrong. His findings were sent back to training camps in the United States, where they shaped the preparation of divisions that had not yet deployed. The mistakes of February 1943 became the curriculum of March 1943. Rommel later recorded his observations. "The tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class," he wrote. "They had recovered very quickly after the first shock and had soon succeeded in damming up our advance." Unlike many German generals, Rommel did not make the mistake of underestimating how quickly the Americans learned from their failures. Carlo D'Este, a historian who studied Rommel's papers, noted that the Desert Fox observed something important about American forces after Kasserine. "Things had rapidly improved for them," Rommel wrote. "Although we had to wait until the Patton army in France to see the most astonishing achievement in mobile warfare, even after the initial disaster, Rommel recognized that he was watching an opponent who would only get better." By May 1943, 3 months after Kasserine, the war in North Africa was over. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into prisoner-of-war cages, more than had surrendered at Stalingrad. The Americans who had panicked at Kasserine were now among the victors. The speed of the American recovery shocked German commanders who had expected a longer period of demoralization. In their experience, units that had been routed required months to rebuild their effectiveness. The Americans had rebuilt in weeks. The psychological resilience this demonstrated was perhaps more troubling than the material resources. German prisoners captured in Tunisia reported their surprise at American logistics. The American soldiers they fought seemed to have unlimited ammunition, unlimited fuel, unlimited food. When German units ran short of supplies, they had to improvise. When American units ran short, replacement supplies arrived within days. The lesson was clear to German soldiers and intelligence officers who analyzed the North African campaign: material superiority could compensate for inexperience. The Americans had been outfought at Kasserine, but they had never been outproduced. As long as American factories kept running, American armies would keep fighting. The question was whether Germany could win quickly enough to make the production differential irrelevant. After Tunisia, that question had an answer: they could not. The pattern repeated throughout the war. American forces stumbled initially, learned rapidly, and improved continuously. The same troops who had fled from German tanks in Tunisia would storm the beaches of Normandy and fight their way across France. The same pilots who had been outmaneuvered by experienced Luftwaffe veterans would eventually sweep the German Air Force from the skies. This adaptive capacity was built into American institutions. The Army's Ground Forces Command maintained a continuous feedback loop between combat units and training establishments. After-action reports from the front were analyzed within weeks and incorporated into revised training programs. Doctrine was updated based on battlefield experience. Equipment was modified to address problems identified by soldiers in combat. The system was not elegant, it was often chaotic. Different units developed different solutions to similar problems. Coordination between branches of service was imperfect. But the chaos was productive. Ideas that worked survived and spread. Ideas that failed were abandoned. The organization as a whole became more effective, even when individual components struggled. German military culture, by contrast, had calcified around fixed doctrines and personal loyalties. Initiative was discouraged, disagreement was often fatal to careers. The same rigidity that had produced brilliant early victories became a liability when circumstances changed. The Wehrmacht could execute plans with devastating efficiency, but it struggled to adapt when those plans went wrong. Hitler made this rigidity worse. He interfered constantly in military operations, overruling his generals based on intuition rather than analysis. Commanders learned that disagreeing with the Führer was career-ending at best and potentially fatal. The honest assessments that might have corrected German strategy were suppressed in favor of reports that told Hitler what he wanted to hear. The contrast between American and German organizational cultures was starkest in the treatment of failure. When American commanders failed, they were replaced, but they were rarely punished. Lloyd Fredendall, who had commanded the debacle at Kasserine Pass, was relieved of command but sent back to the United States to train new troops. His experience, even failed experience, was considered valuable. When German commanders failed, they risked not just their careers but their lives. After the July 1944 assassination attempt, Hitler's paranoia intensified. Generals suspected of disloyalty were executed. Even success was no guarantee of safety if it came at the cost of contradicting Hitler's orders. This created a culture of conformity at the worst possible time. German officers who recognized the impossibility of their strategic situation often said nothing because speaking honestly was too dangerous. The information that reached Hitler was filtered through layers of people who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. The German generals who had dismissed American fighting quality at Kasserine never fully adjusted their assessments. They attributed American success to material abundance alone, refusing to acknowledge the organizational learning that made that abundance effective. They continued to believe that German martial spirit could overcome American industry, even as American armies pushed them back across France, across the Rhine, and into the heart of Germany itself. When D-Day came in June 1944, German commanders in France were surprised by the scale of the invasion force. Over 156,000 Allied troops landed on the first day, supported by nearly 7,000 naval vessels and 11,000 aircraft. The logistics required to move this force across the English Channel and supply it on hostile shores represented an organizational achievement that German planners had considered impossible. The American role in the invasion was overwhelming. The equipment that supported the assault, the landing craft, the transport aircraft, the tanks and trucks that moved inland from the beaches, came largely from American factories. The ships that bombarded German positions were built in American yards. The aircraft that dominated the skies were produced on American assembly lines. German defenders fought with characteristic tenacity. In some sectors, they inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of men and material the Allies brought to bear. When an American infantry company encountered a defended position, they called for artillery support. The artillery fire that followed was not a few rounds but hundreds, sometimes thousands of shells falling in concentrated barrages that pulverized defensive positions. As the infantry advanced, tanks supported them. When the tanks were stopped, aircraft were called in. The Americans had learned to integrate combined arms in ways that multiplied their combat power. German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front said the American style of warfare was different from Soviet tactics. The Soviets threw men at problems, the Americans threw machines. The outcome was similar, overwhelming force applied relentlessly, but the human cost to the Americans was lower. This was deliberate. American doctrine explicitly prioritized firepower over manpower. Why risk soldiers when you could expend ammunition instead? Hitler's misjudgment had consequences that rippled through every level of German strategy. Because he believed America would not intervene effectively, he declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor, bringing into the conflict an enemy he did not need to fight. Because he believed American industry could not deliver on its promises, he allowed the U-boat campaign to continue long after it had ceased to be strategically viable. Because he believed American soldiers were soft, he failed to reinforce the Western Front adequately until it was too late. The declaration of war on America in December 1941 remains one of the most inexplicable strategic decisions of the 20th century. Germany was not obligated to declare war under the Tripartite Pact with Japan. That agreement required mutual defense only if one partner was attacked, not if one partner attacked others. Hitler could have remained neutral toward America while Japan fought in the Pacific. His advisors pointed this out. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop reminded Hitler that a declaration of war would add another enemy without corresponding benefit. But Hitler dismissed the concern. He believed war with America was inevitable and that Germany might as well strike first. More importantly, he did not believe America mattered. A nation of racial mongrels, divided by class and corrupted by Jewish influence, could not possibly affect the outcome of the war. This contempt shaped German strategy throughout the conflict. Resources that might have strengthened the U-boat fleet were diverted elsewhere because the American industrial threat was not taken seriously. Reinforcements that might have bolstered North African defenses were sent to the Eastern Front because the Mediterranean was considered a secondary theater. Preparations for an Allied invasion were inadequate because the scale of American power was not understood. The men who had dismissed American production figures as propaganda watched those figures become reality. The generals who had scorned American fighting quality found themselves retreating before American armies. The strategists who had calculated that Germany could win a war of attrition discovered that attrition favored the side with more to sacrifice. By 1944, Germany was fighting on 3 fronts with resources barely adequate for one. The Eastern Front consumed most of Germany's military strength, the Mediterranean theater drained divisions that might have defended France, and the bombing campaign, conducted largely by American aircraft, devastated German industry and cities. The 8th Air Force, flying from bases in England, sent formations of B-17 and B-24 bombers over Germany in daylight raids that would have been impossible without American industrial capacity. Early raids suffered terrible losses. German fighters and anti-aircraft guns extracted a heavy toll. But the Americans absorbed the losses and kept coming. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 heavy bombers and their crews in a single raid on Schweinfurt's ball bearing factories. The losses were proportionally worse than anything the German Air Force had suffered. American commanders debated whether daylight bombing could continue, but American factories replaced the lost aircraft within weeks. Replacement crews arrived from training programs that had expanded to meet the demand. By the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force was stronger than it had been before Schweinfurt, and now it had long-range escort fighters, the P-51 Mustang, that could protect the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Germany faced an impossible equation. Every American aircraft shot down was replaced by 3 more. Every experienced German pilot killed was irreplaceable. The balance of attrition, which German strategists had believed would favor their superior training and tactics, had reversed. Hermann Göring, who had dismissed American production claims as fantasy, lived to see his air force destroyed by the very industrial might he had mocked. After the war, in a prison interview, he admitted that the tempo of American shipbuilding, particularly Henry Kaiser's program, had surprised and upset German planners. Claims of building ships in 8 to 10 days had seemed fantastic. They were not fantastic. They were true. By the spring of 1945, the Thousand-Year Reich was collapsing. American and British forces advanced from the west, while Soviet armies closed in from the east. German cities burned under round-the-clock bombing that the Luftwaffe was powerless to stop. The factories that had produced the Wehrmacht's weapons were rubble. The final months of the war exposed just how thoroughly German planning had failed. Strategic reserves were exhausted. The fuel supply was depleted. The transportation network was shattered. Industries that had survived years of bombing finally succumbed to the systematic destruction of their supply chains. German soldiers fought on with characteristic stubbornness, but they fought without hope. Ammunition was scarce. Vehicles were abandoned for lack of fuel. Replacement equipment no longer arrived because the factories that made it no longer functioned. The Wehrmacht that had conquered most of Europe was reduced to scrounging for supplies. American forces, meanwhile, seemed to have unlimited resources. When tanks were destroyed, new tanks arrived. When ammunition was expended, more ammunition appeared. The logistics system that supported the Allied advance was itself a marvel of industrial organization, moving millions of tons of supplies across an ocean and a continent to the front lines. The Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that supplied Allied forces after the Normandy breakout, moved 400,000 tons of supplies in just 3 months. American drivers, many of them African Americans serving in segregated transportation units, drove around the clock to keep the advancing armies supplied with fuel, ammunition, and food. The convoy consumed more fuel than the combat forces it supported. But America had fuel to spare. Germany did not. This abundance extended to every aspect of American military operations. American soldiers received hot meals, German soldiers foraged. American units had medical support that evacuated wounded men to field hospitals within a few hours. German wounded often died waiting for treatment that never came. American armies had replacement parts for damaged equipment. German armies cannibalized broken vehicles to keep others running. Hitler died in his bunker on April 30, 1945, still convinced that his analysis had been correct. If Germany had lost, it was because the German people had failed him, because his generals had betrayed him, because fate had conspired against him. He never accepted that his fundamental assumptions about America had been wrong. In his final days, Hitler ranted about miracle weapons that would turn the tide, about divisions that existed only on paper, about counteroffensives that could not possibly succeed. He had lost touch with reality years earlier, but his delusions about American weakness persisted to the end. The nation he had dismissed as racially inferior and industrially incapable had crushed his armies. The evidence was undeniable. The nation he had dismissed as decayed had outproduced Germany by a factor of nearly 3 to 1. The people he had called soft had fought with determination and ferocity across 2 oceans. The industrial capacity he had mocked as propaganda had buried the Wehrmacht under an avalanche of steel and explosives. The statistics told the story. American industry provided almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment produced during the war: 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, 2 million army trucks. The numbers were not propaganda, they were reality. Henry Kaiser did not become a household name after the war. He returned to private industry, eventually building hospitals, automobiles, and housing developments. The shipyards that had launched a vessel every few days were dismantled or converted to peacetime production. The workers who had achieved what established experts said was impossible went back to ordinary jobs. The Willow Run plant, which had produced more bombers than Germany could shoot down, was sold to other manufacturers. For decades, it made automobiles instead of aircraft. The assembly lines that had turned out beat 24 Liberators every 63 minutes were reconfigured for civilian production. By the time General Motors closed the facility in 2010, few remembered what had happened there during the war. The men and women who had built the army of democracy scattered back to their ordinary lives. The welders returned to farms and factories. The riveters became housewives and teachers. The workers who had achieved production miracles that German intelligence dismissed as impossible faded into anonymity. But some of them remembered. Charles Sorensen, the former Ford executive who had designed the Willow Run assembly line, wrote a memoir that documented what his teams had accomplished. Kaiser's shipyard workers formed reunion associations that met for decades after the war. The women who worked in factories across America were eventually honored with the Rosie the Riveter World War II Home Front National Historical Park, established at the site of the Richmond shipyards in 2000. The lesson of what they accomplished should not be forgotten. The German misjudgment of America was not simply a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of imagination. The German leadership looked at America and saw what they expected to see, a soft, divided, undisciplined nation, unsuited for war. They did not see what actually existed, a sleeping giant with industrial capacity, organizational prowess, and human determination that would prove unstoppable once awakened. Isoroku Yamamoto, the Japanese admiral who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, understood what the Germans did not. He had studied in America and knew its capabilities. After Pearl Harbor, he reportedly warned that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. Germany never had an equivalent voice of caution because Germany never took America seriously enough to study it carefully. The factories that built Liberty ships and B-24 bombers have mostly been demolished. The workers who staffed them have passed into history. The war they helped win ended 8 decades ago. But the story matters because misjudgment still costs lives. Nations still underestimate their adversaries. Leaders still confuse their assumptions with reality. The German High Command believed what it wanted to believe about America, and that belief led to catastrophic miscalculation. The roots of German misjudgment ran deep. Nazi ideology taught that racial purity was the foundation of national strength. America, with its immigrant population and African American citizens, seemed to disprove this thesis by its very existence. If the Nazi racial worldview was correct, America should have been weak. Therefore, German leaders convinced themselves, America must be weak. This was the fundamental error. German strategists began with their conclusion and worked backward to find evidence that supported it. They noted American unpreparedness in 1939 and concluded that Americans could not prepare. They observed American diversity and concluded that Americans could not unify. They saw American comfort and concluded that Americans could not sacrifice. Each conclusion was wrong. Americans prepared faster than anyone believed possible. Americans unified around the war effort with remarkable solidarity. Americans sacrificed in ways that would have seemed unthinkable before Pearl Harbor. But German leadership could not see this, because seeing it would have required abandoning assumptions that were central to their worldview. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. The generals and admirals who dismissed American production figures as propaganda, who scoffed at American fighting quality, who believed that material abundance could not compensate for German martial tradition, were not stupid men. They were capable professionals who let preconceptions override evidence. They saw an America they recognized from their assumptions and ignored the America that actually existed. The industrial might that crushed Nazi Germany did not emerge from nowhere. It came from shipyard workers in Richmond who stayed on the job around the clock, from assembly line workers at Willow Run who built aircraft faster than anyone believed possible, from farmers and shopkeepers and teachers who put on uniforms and learned to fight. These were not supermen. They were simply ordinary people who did extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. The housewives who became welders had never imagined themselves working in factories. The farmers who became soldiers had never imagined themselves crossing oceans to fight. The bureaucrats who became logistics officers had never imagined themselves moving millions of tons of supplies across continents. They did these things anyway. They learned skills they had never possessed. They endured hardships they had never anticipated. They achieved feats that experts said were impossible. And when the war was over, most of them went back to ordinary lives and never spoke much about what they had done. The German misjudgment was ultimately a failure to understand human potential. Hitler looked at Americans and saw their limitations. He did not see their capacity for growth, for adaptation, for rising to challenges that seemed insurmountable. He mistook the America of peacetime for the America that would emerge under pressure. This is perhaps the most important lesson of all. Nations are not fixed quantities. Societies are not static. The capabilities that exist in peacetime are not necessarily the limits of what is possible in war. A country that seems weak in one moment can become strong in the next if its people have the will and the organizational capacity to mobilize. Germany had built its military over years of preparation. The Wehrmacht that invaded Poland in 1939 was the product of decades of planning, training, and investment. German strategists assumed that this head start was decisive, that no nation could close the gap quickly enough to matter. They were wrong. America closed the gap in months, not by matching German quality, which would have taken years, but by overwhelming German quantity with American abundance. The American approach was different from the German approach, less elegant, less refined, but ultimately more effective. Hitler looked at America and saw a decayed country that could not hold together. He was looking at the wrong America. The America that mattered was not the America of his prejudices. It was the America that built ships in days and bombers in hours, that took raw recruits and turned them into combat soldiers in months, that absorbed defeats, learned from them, and came back stronger. That America, the real America, was messy and chaotic and inefficient by German standards. But it won.